Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel, the wedding planner called during a regular workday. In under 1 minute, I was erased from my sister's guest list like a stranger. I did not cry or call my family. I just sat in my car until a bank email arrived, changing everything. 3 weeks later, my father appeared at my door, entirely broken. I realized they had not just uninvited me, they had weaponized my name, and their castle built on pride was finally collapsing. My name is Harper Phillips. I am 36 years old. It is important to state those basic facts because on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my entire identity and my place in the world were violently uprooted. I was leaving the sprawling parking lot of Beacon Ridge Logistics in the city of Charlotte. The workday was over. The late October air was thick and humid as I walked toward my sedan. I held the position of senior supply chain manager, a job that demanded precision, a cool head, and an endless capacity for solving other people's crises. I was the person everyone relied on when things fell apart. I opened my car door, tossed my heavy leather tote onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the steering wheel. I was exhausted. I had spent 8 hours untangling a massive shipping dispute, and all I wanted was the quiet sanctuary of my home and the comforting presence of my husband, Jude Mercer. Before I could even insert the key into the ignition, my phone began to vibrate in the center console, the screen illuminated with an unfamiliar local number. I assumed it was a freight vendor calling with a last-minute delay, so I swiped the screen to answer. The voice that greeted me was female, perfectly pitched and dripping with an artificial sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. She introduced herself as Simone Drake. I knew that name well. Simone was the high-end wedding planner my family had retained from my younger sister's lavish wedding, which was exactly 5 weeks away. Initially, a brief wave of relief washed over me. I figured she was calling to double-check the dietary restrictions for the rehearsal dinner or perhaps to confirm the arrival time for the bridal party makeup session. I adjusted my posture, shifting into my usual problem-solving mode, ready to smooth out whatever minor wrinkle had appeared in the grand plan. But Simone did not ask about vegan and Trevor hairstylists. Her voice shifted, losing the synthetic warmth and adopting a tone that was terrifyingly corporate and detached. She stated she was calling to inform me of a finalized update regarding the master guest list. I listened, still uncomprehending, as she clinically delivered the news. She told me that both my name and my husband Jude's name had been entirely struck from the guest registry. We were no longer on the roster for the luxury hotel block. We had been deleted from the transportation shuttle manifests. We were erased from the seating chart for the reception. She paused, letting the heavy silence stretch for a fraction of a second before adding that these modifications had been executed strictly per the family's request. My brain stalled. The words entered my ears, but they simply refused to arrange themselves into a logical sequence. The concept was so profoundly absurd that my immediate physical reaction was a soft, incredulous laugh. I told Simone she must be looking at an outdated document, or perhaps she had confused me with a distant relative. I reminded her of my identity. I was the sister of the bride. I was the maid of honor. Just 1 month prior, my sister had sat cross-legged on my living room rug, drinking my wine and practically begging me to select the perfect reading and write the introduction for her wedding vows because she trusted my judgment more than her own. You do not just silently evict the maid of honor from the entire wedding weekend. I waited for Simone to apologize, to realize her horrific clerical error. Instead, the planner remained utterly unfazed. Her polite facade hardened into something resembling steel. She assured me with a voice devoid of any genuine empathy that there was absolutely no mistake. She went on to explain that she had been specifically instructed by my parents to deliver this news to me privately. The directive was designed, she said, to avoid any public scenes or messy awkwardness on the actual wedding day. The phrase hit me like a physical blow to the chest. To avoid awkwardness. That meant they anticipated my pain and categorized it merely as an inconvenience to their aesthetic perfection. Years of deeply ingrained conditioning, decades of being the compliant and unprotected daughter overrode my shock. I said thank you. I politely thanked the woman who was paid to tell me my family had thrown me away. I ended the call. I did not start the engine. I did not roll down the windows or turn on the climate control. I sat locked in the suffocating, stagnant air of my vehicle for nearly 1 hour. Outside, the parking lot slowly emptied. Co-workers walked past my car, heading home, oblivious to the fact that my entire reality had just shattered. I sat completely motionless, staring blankly at the dashboard until my vision blurred. I tried desperately to rewind the tape of my life over the past several months, searching for the fatal error. Had I said something offensive at the engagement party? Had I failed to contribute enough money to the bridal shower? I meticulously combed through every memory, but I found nothing resembling a justification for this exile. What I did find was a sickening mountain of uncompensated labor. I remembered sacrificing my entire weekend to review the predatory clauses in the catering contract, saving them thousands of dollars. I remembered stepping in to rewrite the chaotic event timeline, because the original plan would have left guests stranded in the sun. I remembered standing at a high-end stationery boutique and casually swiping my own credit card for $300 to cover a small deposit on the custom silk ribbons because my mother had conveniently left her purse in the car and promised to pay me back later, a promise she never kept. I had been the silent, reliable engine keeping their glamorous production running. I was useful until I was suddenly deemed disposable. Eventually, the instinct to seek shelter kicked in. I drove home through the dense Charlotte traffic, operating strictly on autopilot. I have no memory of the journey, only the sudden realization that I was turning my key in the lock of my own front door. Jude was standing in the bright, warm light of our kitchen, preparing dinner. He turned to greet me, but the welcoming smile on his face died the instant he saw my posture. Jude Mercer was a profoundly observant man. He did not possess a frantic or dramatic bone in his body. He took one look at my pale face and hollow eyes, and he instantly knew a catastrophe had occurred. He did not rush me. He did not fire off a dozen panicked questions. He calmly wiped his hands on a dish towel, walked over to the kitchen island, and pulled out a tall stool. He guided me to sit down. He poured a glass of cold water, set it carefully in front of me, and then took the seat directly across from mine. He simply sat there, offering his steady presence, waiting for me to find the breath to speak. I looked at the familiar lines of his face, the man I had built a true partnership with, and the dam finally broke. I did not cry, but my voice shook violently when I finally spoke. I looked him in the eyes and said, "They erased me like a stranger." The warm, fragrant air in the kitchen instantly turned freezing cold. Jude did not flinch, but his jaw clenched tight. That night, the house was submerged in a suffocating silence. In any previous year of my life, the script would have been completely predictable. The old Harper Phillips would have panicked. I would have grabbed my phone and called my mother, weeping profusely, begging to know what I had done to anger them. I would have drafted a dozen graveling text messages to my sister, apologizing for sins I had not even committed, desperate to restore the fragile ecosystem of our family dynamic. I had always been the peacekeeper, the shock absorber for their emotional turbulence. But as I lay awake in the pitch-black bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythmic sound of Jude breathing beside me, something inside me fundamentally shifted. The urge to fix things simply vanished. It was replaced by a cold, hard, and terrifying clarity. I realized that reaching out would only validate their cruelty. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears or the validation of my confusion. I made a quiet, unbreakable promise to myself right there in the dark. I would not make a single phone call. I would not send a single message. If my family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, wanted to cut me out of their lives with the efficiency of a corporate layoff, they would have to own that decision. This time, they would have to be the ones to actively reach out, and they would have to be the ones to explain. I grew up in a very picturesque, deeply unassuming suburb on the edge of Wilmington, North Carolina. To any neighbor walking their dog past our manicured front lawn, the Phillips household looked like the absolute pinnacle of middle-class American decency. My father, Wade Phillips, was a man who took great pride in a polished exterior, dedicating his weekends to ensuring the driveway was perfectly edged and the shutters were freshly painted. My mother, Colleen, practically majored in maintaining social appearances, always ready with a baked good for the neighborhood association or a perfectly ironed dress for local events. Then there was my younger sister, Marin, who arrived in this world exactly 6 years after me. From the moment she could walk and babble, Marin was described by every adult in our orbit with words that sparkled. She was radiant. She was fiercely charming. She possessed an innate gravitational pull that simply made people want to love her, forgive her, and give her things. I, on the other hand, was assigned a very different, much heavier vocabulary. I was the reliable one. I was the child who never caused any trouble. I was the daughter who could always figure things out on her own without needing to be held or guided. When you hear those pragmatic words applied to you day after day, year after year, you slowly begin to mold yourself into their rigid shape. Very early in life, I became intimately accustomed to the physical and emotional act of taking a step backwards so Marin could stand directly in the warm light. It was never done with overt screaming malice, which was exactly what made it so impossible to fight against. It was 1,000 tiny paper-thin concessions that piled up over 2 decades. I remember turning 16 years old. My birthday dinner was unceremoniously postponed for 4 days because it conflicted with Marin having a regional dance recital that my mother insisted required our complete and undivided attention. When I brought home a flawless academic report card or won a highly competitive state debate tournament, my parents would offer a brisk, efficient nod of approval, say they were incredibly proud of my strong work ethic, and then seamlessly pivot the dinner conversation back to the pressing drama of Marin fighting with her middle school friends or Marin needing an expensive new dress for an upcoming athletic banquet. I was not raised in agonizing poverty, and I was certainly not a victim of any cinematic, dramatic, physical tragedy. My childhood was painfully normal, completely lacking in the kind of dark, sensational trauma that makes for a compelling television interview. But that prolonged, quiet normalcy was actually incredibly dangerous. It conditioned me like a dog learning not to bark. It raised me in a silent, pervasive belief system where my portion of love, my share of attention, and my right to take up space in the room could always be trimmed down, shaved off, or completely reallocated to someone else without anyone in the house sensing a moral imbalance. I learned early on that my basic emotional needs were entirely optional, while my sister's fleeting desires were treated as absolute, undeniable mandates. There was only one person in my entire bloodline who saw this toxic dynamic for exactly what it was. My maternal grandmother, Evelyn, possessed a sharp, unsentimental gaze that cut right through my parents and their carefully curated suburban theater. She loved us both, but she saw the vast disparity in how we were being equipped for the harsh realities of the world. Shortly before she passed away from a rapid illness, she executed a will that bypassed my parents entirely for one specific, highly valuable asset. She left a modest but prime piece of commercial real estate located in downtown Wilmington to both Marin and me. She placed the historic brick building under a limited liability company called Harbor Street Holdings. However, she specifically drafted the operating agreement to designate me as the sole managing member with total administrative control. When I visited her quiet hospice room and asked her why she set it up that way, her breathing was shallow and labored, but her voice was like cracked iron. She looked me dead in the eye and said she was putting me in charge of the paperwork because I was the only person in this entire family who was willing to sit down and read the fine print. For nearly 10 years after her death, I quietly and dutifully carried the immense weight of Harbor Street Holdings on my shoulders. It was not a glamorous job. It was a relentless, grinding parade of municipal tax forms, zoning compliance letters, and late-night phone calls from exasperated commercial tenants complaining about a broken commercial water heater or a malfunctioning security gate. It meant agonizing, months-long negotiations with local roofing contractors over the exorbitant cost of repairing a sprawling, leaky flat roof before the hurricane season arrived. I kept the property legally sound, physically intact, and consistently reliably profitable every single financial quarter. A healthy dividend was automatically deposited into a joint account for my sister and me to share equally. And for those same 10 years, almost no one in my immediate family ever bothered to ask me how the building was actually doing. My parents never once inquired about the intense stress of managing a commercial lease while working a full-time corporate job. Marin certainly never offered to sacrifice her weekend to help me file the complex annual state reports or review the skyrocketing property insurance premiums. They simply accepted the monetary benefits of the asset as if it ran on pure magic, willfully blind to the constant, grinding maintenance I performed entirely behind the scenes to keep the foundation from literally rotting away. That same ingrained capacity for absorbing high levels of stress and managing unseen risk was precisely what built my solid, lucrative career in Charlotte. I rose to a senior management position because my brain was naturally anxiously wired to anticipate catastrophic failure. I was exceptionally sharp at dissecting dense vendor contracts, spotting hidden liability loopholes, and mitigating massive supply chain disasters before they could impact the corporate bottom line. It was a highly stressful way to make a living, but it made me financially secure and wholly independent from my parents. More importantly, building that independent life led me directly to Jude. Marrying Jude was the first truly selfish, fiercely protective choice I ever made for my own well-being. He was a man defined by a profound, grounding calmness that I had never experienced in my own home. He possessed a deeply clean emotional slate. With Jude, there were absolutely no hidden agendas, no subtle guilt trips disguised as favors, and no exhausting, passive-aggressive power games. What he said out loud was exactly what he meant in his heart. He did not require me to shrink myself down to make him feel large and important. Yet the stark, beautiful contrast between my peaceful, straightforward marriage and my tangled, family dynamic only served to highlight the core tragedy of my lifelong role in the Phillips household. My family deeply appreciated the kind of hyper-capable person I was whenever they were facing a logistical or financial crisis. They loved my cold competence when they urgently needed someone to decipher a convoluted legal document or fix a broken holiday itinerary or shoulder a heavy thankless burden so they could keep their own hands clean and their minds free of worry. They were profoundly addicted to my utility. The deep heartbreaking problem was that they never once looked at me and saw a vulnerable human being who needed a shield. They looked at Marin and saw a precious, fragile commodity that had to be fiercely guarded at all costs. They looked at me and saw the guard. I was the sturdy, uncomplaining brick wall they built around themselves to keep the wind out. And the tragic, undeniable irony of being a wall is that no one ever stops to worry about whether or not it feels the cold. Marin did not merely get engaged. She launched a hostile, corporate merger heavily disguised as a fairy tale romance. The man she agreed to marry was Preston Vale, the aggressively handsome and effortlessly wealthy heir to a Charleston-based hospitality empire. The Veal family did not just possess money. They possessed generational, quiet Southern capital that controlled a sprawling portfolio of hyper-exclusive boutique hotels and orchestrated high-society events for the coastal elite. From the exact second Preston slipped a blindingly large emerald-cut diamond onto my sister's finger, the entire gravitational pull of our family was irrevocably, violently altered. My mother almost immediately evaporated as an independent human being. She transformed overnight into an unpaid, highly anxious full-time executive assistant for the Vale matriarch. She began dressing differently, adopting neutral linens and cashmere wraps, and she spent her days aggressively agreeing with every extravagant suggestion that drifted down from Charleston. My father, conversely, plunged into a state of prolonged, silent panic. He began spending his evenings locked in his home office, nursing a glass of bourbon, projecting the rigid, hollow confidence of a man desperately pretending he was still steering a massive ship that had already been entirely hijacked by pirates in designer suits. I was formerly drafted into this glittering, terrifying machinery under the heavily weaponized guise of deep sisterly devotion. Marin invited me to a rare, excessively expensive lunch at a downtown bistro. She reached across the white linen tablecloth, grabbed both of my hands with practiced, shimmering sincerity, and formally asked me to be her maid of honor. She looked deep into my eyes and declared she simply did not trust anyone else in the whole world to stand right beside her. It was a flawless, touching performance executed perfectly right before she casually slid a thick, heavy manila folder full of vendor agreements across the table. She took a delicate sip of her sparkling water and casually mentioned that there were just a few minor contracts she urgently needed me to review. Her exact justification was that I was naturally so much better at handling the dry, boring, analytical stuff. That was my designated, inescapable role in her grand narrative. I was simultaneously expected to be the emotional anchor for her aesthetic crisis and the unpaid legal counsel forced to absorb all the unseen logistical anxiety, leaving her completely free to float under the warm spotlight of the bridal glow. The chosen theater for this escalating production was a historically restored, breathtakingly opulent coastal estate situated right on the deep waters of the Charleston harbor. It was not a venue. It was a sprawling aristocratic compound featuring massive wraparound verandas, ancient oak trees dripping with silver Spanish moss, and a grand echoing ballroom that could comfortably house a small military battalion. I walked the manicured grounds during our initial site visit, mentally calculating the sheer square footage of the manicured lawns in the vast dining hall. The estate boasted a maximum seating capacity of well over 500 guests. It was a cavernous palace designed exclusively for excess. This specific, undeniable geographical reality is permanently burned into the forefront of my memory because it stood in direct, laughable defiance of the pathetic, cowardly excuse they would eventually manufacture to physically expel me. There was absolutely no physical universe, no dimension of reality, where that sprawling estate was too crowded to accommodate 2 more dining chairs. The true architect of this accelerating financial madness was the groom's mother, Cellular Vale. Cellular was the terrifying living embodiment of weaponized upper-class politeness. She operated with a suffocating dictatorial grace. She spoke in a voice that was soft, melodic, and almost dangerously quiet, a calculated tactic that forced every single person in the room to physically lean in and hang desperately on her every word. Her posture was impeccable, and her smile was a permanent, flawless, chilling fixture completely disconnected from her actual emotions. She never explicitly demanded anything. Instead, she possessed a horrifying ability to make her personal, incredibly expensive preferences sound like universal, undeniable laws of nature. She would simply tilt her head, offer a sympathetic, gentle sigh, and casually dictate the entire structural aesthetic of a room, manipulating the conversation so masterfully that you felt utterly uncultured and poor if you dared to suggest a more reasonable alternative. Under Cellular's soft, relentless guidance, I watched a creeping massive inflation of the event scale take hold. The original sensible vendor contracts I had meticulously reviewed were quietly being swapped out for dramatically more expensive iterations behind my back. A standard 4-piece string quartet contracted for the ceremony was suddenly inexplicably upgraded to a 14-piece symphonic chamber orchestra because Cellular murmured over afternoon tea that 4 lonely instruments simply could not carry the acoustic weight of the open lawn. The standard beautiful floral arrangements were casually discarded in favor of towering imported cascading botanical installations that required custom steel rigging. I watched in mounting horror as entirely new exorbitant line items materialized out of thin air on the shared digital spreadsheets. There were sudden invoices for custom-muled velvet lounge areas to be placed around the dance floor. There was a staggering 5-figure bill for handcrafted velvet lined welcome boxes exclusively designated for the guests arriving on the groom's side, filled with small batch artisanal bourbons and hampered luxury candles. Every single addition, every ridiculous upgrade, was presented by Cellular not as a wild luxury, but as the bare acceptable minimum standard required to avoid a catastrophic social embarrassment. The definitive breaking point, the exact moment the invisible battle lines were permanently and irreparably drawn, occurred during a sprawling, chaotic design meeting held in the private dining room of a high-end caterer. The massive oak table was entirely covered in imported silk fabric swatches, heavy gilded charger plates, and heavily revised, wildly expensive menu proposals. I sat quietly at the very end of the table, isolating myself from the giddiness, cross-referencing the terrifying new financial proposals against the original agreed-upon budget spreadsheet glowing on my tablet. The numbers were accelerating at a terrifying, unsustainable velocity. When there was a brief, exhausted lull in the excited chatter, I politely cleared my throat. I looked directly across the table at Cellier, Vale, and calmly asked for concrete clarification regarding the cost-sharing addendums for these sudden massive structural upgrades. I pointed out, keeping my voice perfectly level, that the new architectural lighting grid alone was tens of thousands of dollars over the original signed estimate, and I asked how the two families were restructuring the payment schedule to accommodate her new vision. The temperature in the elegant dining room plummeted instantly to freezing. My mother shot me a look of sheer, unadulterated terror, her face draining of all color. Marin suddenly became intensely fascinated by her manicured cuticles, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Cellier Vale, however, did not flinch, did not blink, and did not break her terrifying composure. She placed her delicate porcelain teacup gently onto its matching saucer with a soft clink. She smiled her terrifyingly perfect, icy smile and let out a soft, musical, deeply condescending laugh. She looked at me with eyes that were utterly devoid of any human warmth and stated in her silken southern drawl that a wedding requires emotion, not an audit. The entire room immediately erupted into eager sycophantic laughter. My mother laughed nervously. The highly paid wedding planner laughed out loud. Preston chuckled while rubbing Marin's shoulder. I sat completely still, my hands resting flat on the cold wooden table, the only living person in the room not participating in the humiliating joke. In that chilling, echoing moment of collective amusement, a heavy, suffocating truth finally settled over my shoulders. I finally understood the exact brutal nature of my presence in that room and within the machinery of my own family. I was no longer viewed as a sister. I was not considered a cherished daughter participating in a joyous family union. I had become a glaring, uncomfortable, highly dangerous inconvenience. I was the dark, analytical cloud threatening to rain on their desperately maintained gilded parade in a room entirely filled with people desperately pretending that money was an infinite magical resource generated by pure prestige. I was the only person willing to look directly at the rapidly accumulating debt. From that second forward, I knew my presence was not a comfort to them. It was a threat. I was the lone auditor trapped in a fragile kingdom built entirely on vanity and denial, and they were already silently deciding that the easiest way to keep their beautiful, expensive illusion alive was to completely remove the one person who refused to stop counting the cost. The passage of time became a physical weight in my home. 48 hours dragged by an absolute suffocating silence. The air in the house felt thick, vibrating with the unspoken expectation that my phone would eventually ring, that an agonizing apology would pour through the receiver, that someone in my bloodline would realize the sheer magnitude of the boundary they had just crossed. I kept my phone on the kitchen counter, its black screen reflecting the overhead lights, entirely devoid of notifications. They were waiting me out. It was a silent game of emotional warfare, and history dictated that I would always be the first one to surrender. I had spent my entire existence absorbing their discomfort, smoothing over their careless mistakes, and translating their selfishness into something manageable. They assumed I would simply digest this ultimate rejection in the exact same manner. On the morning of the third day, the silence became too heavy to carry. I picked up the device and opened my text thread with Marin. I did not draft a manifesto of my pain. I did not hurl accusations or demand immediate retribution. Even then, heavily wounded and bleeding out invisibly, my deeply ingrained instinct to protect her kicked in. I typed a message so painstakingly soft and carefully neutralized that it practically apologized for its own existence. I kept my sentences brief. I casually asked if there had perhaps been a strange miscommunication with Simone regarding the final logistics. I offered her a beautiful golden bridge to walk across. I gave her the perfect opportunity to blame a clerical error, to claim the wedding planner had overstepped, to salvage the wreckage of our relationship with a simple face-saving lie. I pressed send, placed the phone face down on the polished granite, and waited. The response did not arrive for another 7 hours. When the screen finally illuminated with her name, my chest tightened. I opened the message and read the short block of text. Marin did not take the bridge. She did not offer an excuse about the wedding planner. Her reply was clinical, stripped of any sisterly affection, and read like a corporate press release drafted by a legal team. She stated that the master guest count had required a sudden, unavoidable shift. She explained that Preston had several highly important investors and key business stakeholders flying in from out of state, and they simply needed the capacity. She ended the brief paragraph with a sentence that effectively stopped my heart from beating for a full second. She asked me in plain text, "Please do not make this personal." I sat perfectly still, staring at those 6 words until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. "Please do not make this personal." The sheer breathtaking audacity of that request felt like a physical blade sliding between my ribs. Being uninvited from a family event was a profound insult, but that specific phrase was a deliberate act of psychological violence. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Marin was acutely aware of exactly how devastating this action was. She knew she was carving me out of her life, and she knew it was deeply personal. But by preemptively demanding that I not treat it as such, she was attempting to strip me of my right to be angry. She was shifting the burden of the crime onto the victim, demanding that I suppress my valid trauma simply because my emotional reaction would be highly inconvenient for her narrative. She chose the easiest, most cowardly path available, hiding behind nameless investors rather than looking her older sister in the eye. A cold, methodical energy suddenly flooded my veins, entirely replacing the lingering sadness. I stood up, walked into my home office, and woke up my laptop. I had retained full digital access to the shared vendor folders I had meticulously organized during the early stages of their planning process. I opened the master venue architectural blueprints and the latest catering proposals. I did not need to guess. I had the exact mathematics right in front of me. I cross-referenced the confirmed seating charts against the maximum occupancy limits of the coastal estate. The venue could comfortably host over 500 guests. Their current finalized list, even with the mysterious influx of VIP investors, hovered right around 250. I opened the spreadsheets for the luxury hotel block I had personally negotiated. There were at least 15 unassigned buffer suites still held under the family contract. I examined the floor plans for the grand ballroom. There were vast empty tracts of hardwood floor explicitly designated for excess tables. The lie was so incredibly lazy that it was almost insulting. There was no space constraint. There was no logistical hurdle. The brutal, unvarnished truth crystallized on my glowing monitor. I had not merely been cut from a party list due to a fire code violation. I had been systematically exiled from the very narrative I had exhausted myself trying to build. I had spent countless hours wrestling with vendors, correcting timelines, and managing the mundane, unglamorous backend operations, specifically so Marin could float through her engagement unbothered. Now that the stage was perfectly set and the expensive lighting was rigged, the architects of the event had decided the mechanic was too unsightly to be allowed in the ballroom. Jude walked into the office and stood quietly behind my chair. He looked over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the undeniable proof of their deception glowing on the screen. He did not need me to explain the math. He saw the empty hotel rooms on the spreadsheet and the vast capacity of the venue. The anger radiating from him was palpable, a dense, heavy heat in the small room. Jude was not a man prone to explosive outbursts, but the quiet intensity of his fury was terrifying in its own right. He did not urge me to pick up the phone and scream at my parents. He did not suggest we drive to Wilmington and burn their manicured facade to the ground. He simply reached down, gently closed the laptop screen, and placed his hands on my shoulders. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of an absolute command. He told me that this time I was not going to be the adult for them. That single sentence became my anchor. It gave me the explicit permission I had never been able to grant myself. I nodded slowly. I picked up my phone, but not to call my family. I dialed the toll-free number for the Coastal Hotel, where I had responsibly booked our accommodations on my personal credit card months in advance. I spoke politely to the reservation agent and canceled the reservation, accepting the small penalty fee without argument. I walked into the guest bedroom, opened the heavy wooden doors of the closet, and reached for the protective garment bag hanging in the back. Inside was the custom-tailored, maid-of-honor gown. It was a beautiful, deeply expensive piece of fabric that I had spent 3 tedious afternoons having altered to fit my frame perfectly. I did not look at it. I shoved the garment bag deep into the darkest corner of the closet, burying it behind heavy winter coats and discarded luggage. By Monday morning, I returned to my normal routine. I drove to my office at Beacon Ridge Logistics. I drank my black coffee. I led team meetings. I negotiated freight rates, and I came home to eat quiet dinners with Jude. On the surface, I was the exact same highly functioning, deeply reliable woman I had always been. I moved through my days as if the earth had not violently shifted beneath my feet. But it was an immaculate, terrifyingly fragile facade. The internal architecture of my loyalty had collapsed completely. What haunted me the most during those crisp autumn weeks was not the absence of an invitation, but the absolute echoing absence of a single phone call. Not one person in my immediate family reached out to check on me. My father never called to offer a weak, stumbling rationalization. My mother never sent a frantic, guilt-ridden text message attempting to smooth the waters. Marin never followed up her sterile text with a genuine apology. They hid themselves inside a cowardly silence, retreating deeper into their opulent bubble. They truly fundamentally believed that I would simply accept the pain they had pushed onto me. They were absolutely convinced that I would digest the disrespect, heal in total isolation, and eventually returned to my designated post as the family shock absorber without ever demanding an explanation. They mistook my engineered silence for my usual compliance, completely unaware that I was no longer protecting them. I was simply waiting. The overwhelming silence that had settled over my life was finally shattered on a random Thursday evening. The phone call did not come from my mother, my father, or my sister. The name glowing on the screen belonged to my cousin, Tesser Kleen. Tesser was an observant, fiercely independent woman who usually kept a safe distance from the core drama of the family. But she had been obligated to attend an intimate, highly exclusive dinner party hosted by the future in-laws in Charleston. I answered the call, expecting a brief, awkward check-in. Instead, I heard the sound of a heavy door closing and a deep, ragged sigh. Tesser was hiding in her own garage, 200 m away, calling me with a confession that felt like a smuggled secret. She bypassed the standard pleasantries entirely. She told me she could not stomach the hypocrisy any longer and felt I deserved to know the exact conversation that had unfolded over expensive wine and dry-aged steaks. Tesser painted a vivid, sickening picture of the private dining room. The two families had gathered to finalize the weekend itinerary and congratulate themselves on their exquisite taste. Sometime between the main course and the arrival of the artisan desserts, my sudden glaring absence from the final timeline was casually brought up by the groom's father. Tesser described how Cellular Vale had paused, dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, and offered a soft, perfectly calibrated sigh. Cellular had looked around the table and stated with terrifying conviction that I possessed a very specific intense energy. She declared to the entire room that I carried the aura of someone who naturally spots problems and demands logical solutions. She went on to explain in her silken hypnotic voice that a luxury wedding weekend required an atmosphere that was entirely beautiful, completely smooth, and absolutely free of any difficult questions. I was, according to the matriarch, a practical auditor who would inevitably disrupt the seamless, glittering fantasy they were trying to construct. The devastating blow, however, was not delivered by Cellular. I expected cruelty from the Vale family. The true knife was twisted by the woman who raised me. Tesser's voice cracked slightly as she relayed the next part. She told me that when Cellular made that insulting assessment, my mother did not stiffen. My mother, Colleen, did not politely defend her eldest daughter. Instead, she leaned across the table and eagerly agreed. My mother had justified my unceremonious exile by offering me up as a sacrificial lamb to appease the wealthy hosts. She told the table that I had always been incredibly tough, endlessly busy with my corporate career, and simply not a very sentimental creature. She actually spoke the words aloud, assuring everyone present that I would probably understand being removed from the guest list because I was far too practical to care about a party. Hearing that specific sentence echoed through the phone line was like being violently dragged backward through 30 years of my own history. It was a brutal, blinding epiphany that recontextualized my entire childhood. The unshakable reliability I had cultivated for decades, the very trait I had desperately honed to earn their love, and keep our household stable had never actually been respected or cherished. It was merely a highly convenient excuse. They had systematically weaponized my emotional endurance to justify starving me of basic affection. They genuinely believed that because I possessed the strength to withstand the cold, I did not require a place near the fire. My stoicism was not a virtue to them. It was a loophole. It was the absolute perfect justification for shrinking my share of the family's resources, time, and empathy without feeling a single ounce of moral guilt. I thanked Tessa profusely for her courage, ended the call, and quietly went to work dismantling every single invisible bridge connecting me to Wilmington. I did not write a manifesto or make a dramatic declaration of independence. I simply stopped being their unpaid, heavily exploited safety net. I ceased all administrative activities that fell outside the strict, legally mandated boundaries of a limited liability company. When the quarterly estimated tax deadlines approached, I intentionally withheld the polite, bulleted reminder email I had sent my father for the past 10 years. I stopped compiling proactive, easily digestible financial summaries for the commercial property, choosing instead to let the raw, dense data sit completely untouched in the shared digital portal. When my mother forwarded a convoluted homeowner's insurance document with a casual subject line asking if I could just take a quick peek when I had a spare minute, I dragged the message directly into the digital trash bin. I watched their minor self-inflicted logistical crisis pile up, and I did absolutely nothing to intervene. The vast, deep reservoir of mental energy I used to burn on anticipating my sister's emergencies and managing my parents' relentless anxieties suddenly had nowhere to go. I took every single ounce of that sharp, analytical focus and channeled it directly into my position at Beacon Ridge Logistics. There was a massive, highly complex supplier restructuring deal looming on the horizon. It was a grueling project involving dozens of international freight tariffs and regional distribution bottlenecks. Previously, I had considered stepping back from the negotiation team to ensure I had enough mental bandwidth to manage a final frantic weeks of wedding planning. Without the dead weight of my family dragging me down, I attacked the corporate contracts with a ruthless, icy clarity. Over the span of 14 days, I dissected the vendor proposals, identified a massive redundancy in the regional transit network, and successfully closed a deal that secured millions of dollars in savings for the upcoming fiscal year. The sweeping victory immediately caught the attention of the executive board, opening the door for a senior director promotion, a highly lucrative opportunity I would have historically sacrificed on the altar of family duty. Simultaneously, a profound and entirely unfamiliar sense of peace began to settle over my personal life. I started experiencing the terrifying, beautiful sensation of a weekend that actually belonged to me. Jude and I spent long Saturday mornings drinking rich coffee on our back patio, entirely undisturbed by panicked phone calls about mismatched floral arrangements or lost deposit receipts. We hosted impromptu, loud dinners with our neighbors, pouring excellent wine and laughing until our sides physically itched. I was actively building a life that did not orbit the chaotic, demanding gravity of my sister's desires. The deep, agonizing wound of their collective betrayal was finally beginning to dry out. A protective scab was forming over the trauma. I was slowly starting to believe that the worst of the storm had passed and that I could simply walk away, leaving them to drown in their gilded, superficial world. But the cold mechanical reality of high finance had a very different plan. The delicate illusion of safety completely spattered on a rainy Tuesday morning, precisely 3 weeks before the scheduled ceremony in Charleston. I was sitting at my office desk reviewing a standard quarterly operations forecast when an automated notification popped into my secure email inbox. The sender was the commercial lending division of the regional bank that held the primary operating accounts for Harbor Street Holdings. The subject line referenced an executed legal document regarding a commercial bridge loan. I stared at the glowing black text, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. The commercial property my grandmother left us was completely unencumbered. It had been entirely paid off for over a decade, and I had spent years meticulously ensuring it stayed perfectly clear of any debt. There was absolutely no logical or legal reason for a loan document to exist under that company name. as my hand trembled and I moved my computer mouse to open the attached encrypted file. The final horrifying puzzle piece clicked violently into place. The sickening humiliation of being erased from the guest list, the desperate attempts to keep me physically away from the coastal venue, the fabricated excuses about seating capacity and my supposed lack of sentimentality. It was never merely about saving face or maintaining a flawless aesthetic for the high society guests. They were not afraid that I would ruin the elegant photographs. They were utterly terrified that I would see the financial ledgers. The secure digital portal for the regional commercial bank loaded with agonizing slowness on my laptop screen. The encrypted notification had bypassed my standard inbox and triggered a high-priority alert tied directly to my legal status as the managing member of Harbor Street Holdings. Someone within my family had clumsily attempted to reroute the primary mailing address on file to my father's home office, but banking compliance laws mandated that the registered executive officer received duplicate copies of any new debt origination. I clicked the glowing blue link to download the master file. The document had a read as a finalized commercial bridge loan agreement. The principal amount printed at the top of the first page caused all the air to rush out of my lungs. It was an absolutely staggering sum of $300,000. The commercial property my grandmother had left us was completely unencumbered. The original mortgage had been entirely paid off for over a decade, and I had spent years meticulously ensuring the asset stayed perfectly clear of any toxic financial leverage. There was absolutely no logical, ethical, or business reason for a loan document of that magnitude to exist under our company name. My hands physically trembled as I scrolled through the dense legalese, hunting for the execution pages. I reached page 14, the section designated for the unanimous written consent of all managing members. My sister's signature was scrolled across the top line, frantic and uneven. Right below it, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was my own signature. It looked flawless at first glance, but my eyes were trained to catch discrepancies. It was a digital ghost. It was the exact identical signature I had penned on a 5-year-old commercial lease renewal, neatly lifted from a PDF archive and pasted onto the authorization line. The operating agreement I had drafted a decade ago strictly required verified, physically notarized signatures for any corporate encumbrance exceeding $10,000. My family had not merely made a poor financial decision. They had actively committed forgery to mortgage my inheritance without my knowledge. The accompanying disbursement ledger uploaded in the bank portal told an even more horrifying story. The loan was not sitting safely in an escrow holding account. It was actively bleeding out. I tracked the outbound wire transfers with a rising sense of nausea. There was a clear transaction of $45,000 sent directly to the coastal estate venue. There was another line item showing $28,000 wired to the bespoke botanical installation firm in Charleston. The stolen money was being mainlined directly into the swollen, grotesque budget of the wedding. I dug deeper, opening the corresponding vendor invoices that had been submitted to the bank to justify the massive draw requests. A sickening, brilliantly manipulative pattern immediately emerged from the paperwork. Every single extravagant, ridiculous upgrade demanded by the groom's wealthy mother was being billed exclusively to my family's side of the ledger. However, the invoices contained vague, entirely non-binding notes typed into the margins. I read phrases like balance to be reconciled between families post-event and pending Vale family contribution. There was absolutely no legally binding contract, no signed promissory note, and no secure escrow agreement forcing the groom's parents to ever pay a single cent of that money back. My parents were blindly absorbing massive, fraudulent debt based on the polite, whispered promises of high society vultures. I did not scream. I did not throw my laptop across the room. The sheer magnitude of the legal betrayal bypassed my emotional centers entirely and triggered a cold, hyper-focused survival instinct. At 8 in the morning the following day, I walked into the sleek glass-walled conference room of my corporate attorney, Naomi Sutter. I had also authorized a trusted forensic bookkeeper from my corporate logistics network to join us. We spread the printed financial ledgers, the forged consent forms, and the vendor invoices across the polished mahogany table. I needed to know exactly what kind of war I was walking into. I looked Naomi squarely in the eyes and asked her to clarify if we were looking at a complex civil dispute, a textbook case of criminal wire fraud, or both. Naomi traced the forged digital signature with the silver tip of her expensive pen. She was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who did not deal in family sentiment or emotional excuses. She confirmed without hesitation that this was a severe felony, but she also saw the immense, unassailable leverage it handed me. She patiently explained the rigid mechanical protocols of the bank's fraud department. According to the loan schedule, there was one final massive disbursement of $150,000 set to clear precisely 48 hours before the wedding ceremony. This final critical wire transfer was designated to pay the remaining balances for the catering staff, the lighting crew, the luxury shuttle services, and the venue management. Naomi looked up from the papers and delivered the killing blow. She explained that if I submitted a formal sworn affidavit of forgery to the lending institution's legal department on that exact day, the bank would be legally obligated to trigger an immediate hard freeze on the entire credit line. The final disbursement would bounce. The money would stop dead in its tracks, and every single vendor in Charleston would instantly demand payment in full before opening their doors. Sitting in that quiet, heavily air-conditioned office, the true devastating reason for my sudden exile hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. It had absolutely nothing to do with the guest list capacity limit. It had nothing to do with the groom's mysterious investors. It was not even about Cellular Vale finding my personality too intense for her elegant aesthetic. It was pure, desperate, calculated risk management. If I had been present at that luxurious coastal estate, participating in the rehearsal dinner, getting my hair styled with the bridal party, I would have been relatively relaxed. But I also would have eventually checked my phone. I review the commercial property bank balances every single Friday afternoon like absolute clockwork. If I was physically standing inside the venue when I saw the missing funds and the fraudulent loan, the explosion would have happened right there on the manicured lawn in front of the wealthy in-laws. My parents and my sister had to physically remove me from the premises to ensure I remained entirely distracted, isolated, and safely in the dark while the final fraudulent wire transfers cleared. A lesser, younger version of myself would have driven straight to my parents' house in Wilmington and shattered their front windows. I would have demanded answers, screamed until my throat bled, and begged them to explain how they could treat my livelihood with such reckless contempt, but anger is loud and loud is careless. True power is completely silent. I instructed the forensic bookkeeper to secure every single digital IP log, timestamp, and vendor receipt into an encrypted file. I turned to Naomi and asked her to draft the exact legal notices required to freeze the account, leaving the submission date blank. I packed the heavy folders into my leather briefcase, shook their hands, and walked out of the law firm into the bright, crisp autumn sunlight. I was not going to blow up their phones or draft a tearful email. I was going to construct a floorless, inescapable trap. I was going to lock my emotions away in a steel box, step back into the shadows, and let the relentless, suffocating pressure of their own crushing financial ruin force the first domino to fall. I knew the money was running out, and I knew exactly who they would have to face when it did. As the days bled away and the countdown to the coastal ceremony shrank to mere hours, the invisible infrastructure of the wedding began to fracture visibly because my corporate email address was still buried deep in the carbon copy line of several early vendor communication threads. I had a silent front row seat to the escalating panic. The digital paper trail was becoming frantic. The bespoke lighting firm sent a final, legally binding notice stating it would absolutely refuse to load their heavy rigging trucks onto the estate property without the final wire transfer clearing their accounts by Friday at noon. The high-end caterer, who was currently sourcing rare imported seafood and reserving highly paid contract staff, issued a unyielding reminder regarding their strict payment schedule. Simone Drake, the previously unflappable and highly condescending wedding planner, was now firing off emails with a distinct, sharp edge of hysteria. Her subject lines were suddenly littered with urgent capital letters and demands for immediate callbacks. The money from the initial fraudulent bank draw had simply evaporated, swallowed whole by the bloated, grotesque scale of the event. The financial well had completely run dry right before the final, critical payouts were due. Then the predictable attempts at emotional suppression began. My mother, Colleen, broke her cowardly silence with a text message that was a breathtaking masterpiece of manipulative deflection. She did not ask how I was coping with the exclusion. She did not address the massive commercial loan secured by my forged signature. She simply typed a vague, pleading sentence, begging me to please just stay quiet and not do anything to make this week more stressful for everyone involved. The sheer delusion of her request was staggering. In her warped, self-serving reality, I was not the victim of severe financial fraud and identity theft. I was the looming threat. I was the dangerous, volatile element that needed to be carefully managed and suppressed so they could continue enjoying the luxurious party they were actively stealing to pay for. Marin followed up shortly after with a direct voice note. Her tone was not remotely apologetic. It was defensive, clipped, and heavily laced with a fragile, manufactured exhaustion. She sighed deeply into her phone microphone and told me not to turn this situation into a war. She carefully, deliberately avoided any mention of the commercial property, the frozen bank accounts, or the blatant forgery of my name. There was absolutely no accountability in her voice, only a stern command for my continued submission. Listening to her recording in the quiet of my kitchen, a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. Marin was not acting out of spontaneous malice. She was operating from a lifetime of deeply ingrained family conditioning. She genuinely, fundamentally believed that I had a moral obligation to prioritize the aesthetic perfection of her wedding day over my own legal and financial survival. She expected me to happily absorb a crushing unauthorized commercial debt simply because it was her special weekend and she was the bride. That single realization effectively severed the very last thread of sisterly obligation I held in my heart. I did not reply to either of my family members. I was no longer interested in engaging in petty, exhausting, familial squabbles. I was methodically constructing a chessboard, sitting in my home office with Jude quietly reviewing the printed vendor ledgers beside me and Naomi Sutter on a secure encrypted video call. We meticulously drafted a non-negotiable, ironclad list of legal demands. It was a surgical strike designed to dismantle their entire operation. The terms we outlined were absolute and uncompromising. First, my parents had to immediately execute the necessary legal paperwork to dissolve the fraudulent bridge loan and fully release the lien on Harbor Street Holdings. Second, they were explicitly required to publicly openly confess to the Veal family that my absence from the wedding was entirely their own cowardly unilateral decision, entirely stripping away the lie about seating capacity. Third, we demanded a comprehensive forensic audit of every single dollar of debt they had accrued over the past 6 months. Finally, they had to sign a legally binding cease and desist order permanently barring them from ever affixing my name or my company's name to another financial document. Naomi possessed the necessary legal leverage to detonate the entire operation instantly. But I needed a very different kind of resolution. I did not want to blow the bridge up from a safe distance in Charlotte. I wanted them physically standing on it when it collapsed. I instructed Naomi to formally notify the regional bank's fraud division of the signature discrepancy, but to officially request that the account be placed in a temporary review pending status for exactly 48 hours. This highly specific, calculated bureaucratic maneuver effectively froze the final disbursement of funds without immediately triggering a catastrophic public criminal investigation. It halted the money, plunging the wedding logistics into total paralysis, but left a tiny agonizing window of time before the cancellation became permanent. It was precisely enough time to force my family into a locked room with me. I did not stay in my house and wait for the inevitable fallout. I packed a small structured overnight bag with my sharpest business attire and drove the long stretch of highway down to the coastal city of Charleston. I completely bypassed the luxurious, sprawling block of oceanfront suites designated for the wedding party and the wealthy guests. Instead, I booked a quiet, highly secure room at a corporate hotel located downtown, paying with my own personal credit card, strictly under my own name. I was not traveling as a discarded guest, desperately hoping to crash a party or beg for a seat at the table. I was not arriving as a wounded, heartbroken sister seeking closure or a tearful reconciliation. I was arriving as a managing executive whose corporate assets had been illegally breached by thieves. I unpacked my pressed navy suit, laid out my heavy legal folders on the small writing desk, and watched the city lights flicker over the dark water of the harbor. The board was set. The trap was fully armed. When everything was perfectly aligned, I realized a beautiful, empowering truth. I did not need to hunt anyone down. I did not need to make a dramatic, screaming entrance at the rehearsal dinner or stand outside the venue gates demanding attention. I finally understood the cold, mechanical reality of pure leverage. The luxury vendors were aggressively demanding their final wire transfers. The bank was completely frozen. The financial oxygen was rapidly draining from their meticulously constructed fantasy. I sat in the quiet solitude of my hotel room, poured myself a glass of ice water, and simply waited. I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that the crushing, suffocating pressure of impending public humiliation and total financial ruin would force the issue for me. I did not have to chase anyone. They had absolutely nowhere left to run. The stolen money was gone. The gilded facade was cracking violently, and very soon the first desperate person in my family would have no choice but to come knocking on my door, begging for the very lifeline they had tried to steal. The pale, bruised light of the early dawn was just beginning to creep across the Charleston skyline on the day before the wedding. I was already awake, sitting in the heavy armchair by the window of my downtown hotel room, holding a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I watched the quiet street below. Just past 6:00 in the morning, a familiar dark sedan pulled slowly into the temporary parking zone directly across from the hotel lobby. I recognized my father's car immediately. He did not get out. I sat perfectly still and watched him from my vantage point on the fourth floor. He remained locked inside that vehicle for 10 agonizing minutes. I could faintly see the outline of his hands gripping the steering wheel. A man desperately trying to summon the courage to face the daughter he had just tried to bury when the sharp, hesitant knock finally came at my door. I did not rush to answer it. I set my ceramic mug onto the glass table, smoothed the front of my tailored trousers, and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The man standing in the hallway was practically unrecognizable as the proud, image-obsessed patriarch who had raised me. Wade Phillips looked as though he had aged a full decade in the span of 3 weeks. His normally crisp, perfectly ironed, button-down shirt was deeply wrinkled and untucked at the hip. His shoulders were slumped, completely devoid of their usual rigid posture. His eyes were violently bloodshot, surrounded by dark, bruised hollows that spoke of countless consecutive nights without a single hour of rest. He possessed the frail, uncoordinated gait of a man whose internal foundation had completely turned to dust. I did not offer him a warm greeting. I did not step aside and welcome him with open arms. I simply left the door open and walked back into the center of the room. He followed me inside, moving with a heavy, dragging shuffle, and collapsed onto the edge of the small sofa. The silence between us stretched out, thick and suffocating. The quiet in the room was not peaceful. It was heavy with the stench of a decades-long life finally rotting away. I waited. I was not going to make this easy for him. I was not going to prompt him or offer a comforting segue. If he wanted to speak, he would have to pull the words from his own throat. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was a hollow, trembling rasp that sounded like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. He did not start with an apology. He started with a confession of his own profound weakness. He told me about the suffocating, relentless pressure cellular veil had applied from the very first week of the engagement. He described how the groom's family operated. They never yelped. They never made crude demands. They simply introduced astronomical costs into the planning process, assuming the position of aristocratic authority, and then used a chilling, polite silence to force my parents to absorb the financial shock. Preston, the man my sister was preparing to marry, watched his mother financially execute my father and did absolutely nothing to intervene. The Vales essentially dared my family to admit they could not afford the lifestyle, and my father's fragile pride simply could not bear the humiliation of saying no. He stared down at his shaking hands, unable to meet my gaze, and finally admitted the most agonizing truth of all. He confessed that severing me from the guest list was never truly about seating capacity, nor was it about satisfying Cellular Vale's desire for a perfectly curated aesthetic. It was a desperate, calculated quarantine. They knew I possessed the financial acumen to see through the hollow facade. They knew that if I was present at the bridal showers, the rehearsal dinners, and the venue walkthroughs, I would inevitably see the bloated vendor invoices. I would hear the conversations about the massive wire transfers. I would put the pieces together. They had to banish me from the entire weekend strictly to keep me completely blinded to the massive commercial loan they were quietly taking out against my name. I stood a few feet away, my arms crossed over my chest, absorbing the clinical reality of his betrayal. Then I asked the one question that still possessed the power to draw blood. I'd asked him exactly how much Marin knew. My father flinched. He attempted to answer with a stammering evasive half-truth, instinctively trying to throw a protective blanket over his youngest child. He started to say that she was entirely focused on her dress and the flowers, that she was oblivious to the mechanics of the funding. I cut him off sharply. I demanded the absolute truth. The fight drained out of him instantly. He slumped further into the cushions and admitted that Marin was not entirely innocent. She was fully aware that Harbor Street holdings had been put up as collateral. She knew they were using my inheritance as a temporary financial lever to save her luxurious event. She simply chose not to ask any detailed questions because she was absolutely terrified that the ugly mechanical truth would somehow tarnish the magical perfection of her wedding narrative. She traded my long-term security for her own temporary willful ignorance. She wanted the imported orchids in the string orchestra so desperately that she was perfectly willing to let my name be forged to secure them, so long as no one forced her to look directly at the bloody knife. Then my father looked up at me with those red, exhausted eyes and delivered a sentence that hurt far worse than any insult or exclusion I had endured over the past month. He spoke barely above a whisper. He said they did it because they genuinely thought I would forgive them much faster than the bank would. That single collection of words encapsulated my entire existence within that family. It was the absolute distillation of my lifelong punishment for being the strong, reliable daughter. They had done the horrific calculus in their heads. They weighed the risk of defaulting on a corporate loan against the risk of destroying their relationship with their eldest daughter. And they chose to sacrifice me because I was the cheaper option. I was the safe bet. They banked entirely on my lifelong habit of swallowing my own pain to keep their lives comfortable. They perceived my love and my loyalty as an infinite, heavily discounted resource that they could endlessly exploit. They were far more terrified of a commercial lending institution than they were of breaking my heart, because they fundamentally believed my heart was designed to endure their abuse without ever demanding repayment. Wade did not explicitly ask me for money in that hotel room. He did not directly demand that I call the fraud department and release the frozen funds, but his sheer naked desperation filled every corner of the room. He was a man staring down the barrel of total catastrophic ruin. If the final payment did not clear today, the vendors would walk out. The entire high society event would collapse in a spectacular, highly public disaster. The wealthy Vale family would discover that they had allied themselves with financial frauds, and the ensuing scandal would permanently destroy whatever miserable shred of dignity my father still possessed. He was silently begging me to be the safety net one last time. He needed a way out before the clock ran down completely. I looked at the broken man on my sofa, and I felt absolutely nothing. The reservoir of empathy I used to hold for him was completely bone dry. I did not scream at him. I did not shed a single tear. I spoke to him with the cold, measured precision of a corporate liquidator finalizing a hostile takeover. I told him I was giving them one final opportunity to contain the explosion. I laid out a strict non-negotiable timeline, exactly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin tomorrow afternoon. There would be a mandatory meeting in the private mahogany library of the coastal venue. I demanded that every single responsible party be physically present in that room. That included him, my mother, Marin, Preston, and Cellular Vale. I told him that if any single person was missing from that room, or if anyone attempted to delay the meeting by a single minute, my attorney, Naomi Sutter, had strict standing orders to instantly file the formal challenge against the validity of the signed consent papers. The fraud investigation would become public record immediately, and the police would likely arrive at the estate before the string quartet finished tuning their instruments. My father slowly nodded his head. He did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate the terms. He slowly pushed himself off the sofa, looking like a man walking toward his own execution, and shuffled out of my hotel room without saying another word. I closed the door behind him, listening to the soft click of the heavy lock engaging, and turned back to the window to watch the morning sun finally break fully over the water. Exactly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I walked through the heavy gilded double doors of the coastal estate. The sprawling property was a hive of frantic, high-priced activity. Caterers in crisp white uniforms rushed past carrying heavy silver trays. Florists balanced precariously on tall wooden ladders, aggressively weaving thousands of imported white roses into the towering entrance arches. I completely ignored the chaotic, expensive ballet happening around me. I was not wearing the soft, pastel silk gown of a discarded bridal party member, nor was I dressed as a contrite family guest. I was armored in a sharply tailored dark navy blue business suit. My corporate attorney, Naomi Sutter, walked in perfect, intimidating lockstep beside me. In my right hand, I carried a heavy black leather folder that held vastly more weight than any floral arrangement on the property. The designated meeting place was the estate's private library. It was a cavernous room smelling strongly of old mahogany, expensive leather bindings, and sudden suffocating panic. When I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped inside, the occupants of the room physically froze. My father, Wade, sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, staring blankly at his hands. My mother, Colleen, stood near the massive stone fireplace, nervously clutching a linen tissue. Marin was standing in the center of the room, draped in a pristine white silk robe, her hair meticulously half-pinned up by the styling team. Preston stood protectively close to her, flanked heavily by his parrots. Cellier and Reed Vale, Simone Drake, the previously arrogant and unyielding wedding planner, stood awkwardly near the large bay window. Simone's perfectly contoured face registered absolute shock. She clearly expected me to arrive with tear-streaked makeup, desperately begging for a folding chair at the very back of the reception tent, or pleading for a tearful family reconciliation. Instead, I walked to the head of the massive antique desk with the calm authority of someone who already knew the room was built on lies. Cellier Vale immediately attempted to seize control of the narrative, relying entirely on her weaponized Southern grace. She drew herself up, smoothing the front of her floorless silver dress, and spoke in that silken, highly condescending drawl. She tilted her head, offered a pathetic, fake sigh of sympathy, and stated that choosing this specific, highly emotional moment to air my petty personal grievances was incredibly cruel and deeply inappropriate for everyone involved. Before she could finish her meticulously crafted insult, Naomi moved. My attorney stepped forward and dropped the thick stack of financial documents directly onto the center of the polished wood table. The heavy, sharp thud echoed loudly against the wooden walls. Naomi did not raise her voice. She let the dense paperwork do the shouting. She systematically laid out the master disbursement schematic from the regional bank alongside the legally binding operating agreement for Harbor Street Holdings. I took over the conversation, methodically peeling back the thick layers of their collective delusion. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I spoke with the icy mechanical precision of a seasoned prosecutor, outlining a financial crime. I pointed directly to the printed commercial loan consent forms. I demonstrated, citing specific clauses from the limited liability company charter, that the signature authorizing the massive debt encumbrance was completely fraudulent. I watched the blood drain entirely from my mother's face as I spread out the vendor invoices side by side. I showed the entire room exactly how every single exorbitant upgrade, from the massive symphony orchestra to the custom velvet lounge installations, had been systematically and quietly built exclusively to my parents' side of the ledger. I addressed the Veal family directly, pointing out that their casual, polite verbal promises to split The costs equally were entirely absent from any binding legal contract. They had aggressively forced my father to mortgage my inheritance on a polite handshake that they never possessed the intention to honor. The true devastating detonation, however, came from a single printed sheet of paper that Naomi smoothly slid across the table toward the groom's father. It was a leaked internal communication between Reed Vale and his senior executive assistant. The black text on the white page was undeniable and legally disastrous. Reed had explicitly instructed his corporate accounting staff to route all immediate luxury vendor invoices to the bride's family. His written directive stated they would theoretically rebalance the accounts after the honeymoon, but he specifically noted they should absolutely avoid making a big deal out of the actual expenses until after the marriage certificate was permanently signed. He was intentionally, maliciously bleeding his future in-laws completely dry while maintaining a perfectly clean aesthetic facade. I watched Marin read the printed email. All the artificial glowing bridal radiance drained instantly from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow and terrifyingly young. She turned her head slowly to look at the man she was supposed to marry in less than 120 minutes. I revealed the final sickening detail to my sister. Preston had been copied on those internal corporate emails for months. He had watched my parents absorb massive fraudulent debt to fund his mother's opulent, aristocratic vision, and he had chosen absolute silence simply because he did not want to risk lowering the elite, luxurious standards of his own weekend. He prioritized the expensive champagne and the aesthetic perfection over the financial survival of his bride's family. Right at that precise moment, the heavy library door cracked open. The estate's venue manager stepped inside, clutching a digital tablet tightly to his chest. Looking completely terrified of the heavy toxic tension saturating the room, he cleared his throat nervously and announced that it was currently approaching 12:00 in the afternoon. He stated, his voice trembling slightly, that if the bank did not officially release the final guaranteed wire transfer within the next 30 minutes, his corporate office was mandating severe immediate cuts to the evening reception. The premium open bar would be completely shut down and padlocked. The expensive 14-piece band would absolutely not be allowed to take the stage. The luxurious glittering facade was literally crumbling to pieces right in front of their eyes. Minute by minute, dollar by dollar, Cellular Vale finally lost her iron grip on her upper-class composure. The polite mask slipped completely, shattering on the floor. Her perfectly painted lips twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. She glared at me, her eyes filled with raw, unadulterated hatred, and hissed the most venomous sentence she could possibly muster. She declared that I was ruining everything because I possessed no grace and that I had never truly come to this venue as a member of the family. I held her furious gaze, feeling absolutely no sting from her pathetic, desperate words. My heart rate did not even elevate. I looked dead into her eyes and told her she was absolutely correct. I stated clearly that today I was not standing here as a sister, and I was certainly not here as a guest. I told her I was standing in this room strictly as the person she had fully intended to foot the bill. The room fell into a suffocating dead silence. The fundamental balance of power had permanently and violently shifted. Marin slowly turned her head back toward Preston. Her hands were shaking violently against the pristine white fabric of her silk robe. Her eyes were wide open, completely stripped of any lingering, naive illusions. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, but it carried sharply to every single dark corner of the silent mahogany room. She looked at her fiancé, her voice trembling, and asked him what else he had not told her. For the very first time since the massive diamond engagement ring was slipped onto her finger, the gravity in the room no longer revolved around the sparkling, expensive illusion of a beautiful wedding. It revolved entirely, brutally around the truth. I did not raise my voice a single decile. I did not slam my palms against the heavy mahogany desk or demand tearful apologies. The time for emotional outbursts had passed weeks ago. Instead, I opened the black leather folder and began systematically reading the contents aloud. I recited the precise dates of the forged signatures. I listed the staggering sums of money drawn against my commercial property. I read the exact timestamps of the internal communications where the Vale family orchestrated the financial slaughter of my parents. I stripped away the intoxicating scent of imported flowers and the soft glow of the venue lighting, reducing their grand societal event to a sterile, ugly ledger of theft and cowardice. Before I even reached the final page of the forensic audit, my mother's legs simply gave out beneath her. She sank heavily into a velvet armchair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute reality of her actions was laid bare in front of the wealthy family she had tried so desperately to impress. But it was my father who truly shocked the room. For the very first time in my 36 years of life, W.D. Phillips did not scramble to protect the illusion of our perfect family. He stood up straight, physically moved away from the Vale family, and stepped directly to my side of the table. He looked squarely at the aristocratic in-laws across from us and admitted the ugliest truth. He confessed out loud, his voice cracking, that they had banished their eldest daughter from the guest list entirely to hide their own cowardly, desperate financial decisions. I closed the letter folder. I looked at the stunned faces staring back at me and laid out my final non-negotiable terms. I told them with absolute clarity that I was not going to spend one single cent of my own money to save this wedding. However, I offered to temporarily suspend the criminal fraud filings for this specific afternoon on 3 absolute conditions. First, my parents had to immediately execute the legal release of the lien on Harbor Street holdings. Second, the Veal family would take immediate full financial responsibility for every single exorbitant upgrade they had demanded. Third, the unvarnished truth about why I was removed from the guest list had to be spoken directly to the extended family members currently gathering outside on the manicured lawns. The aristocratic mask of the Vale family instantly and violently disintegrated. Reed Vale aggressively refused to shoulder the massive financial burden of the upgrades, his polite demeanor vanishing into cutthroat corporate defensiveness. Cellular Vale's face flushed a deep, angry red as she shrieked about the catastrophic damage this would do to their elite social standing in the city. But the most devastating reaction came from the groom. Instead of stepping forward to shield Marin from the collapse of her dream, Preston turned his back to her entirely. He looked frantically at the venue manager and asked if it was possible to quickly downgrade the reception to a smaller closed-door version that would not attract the attention of the local media or high society gossip blogs. That single cowardly question was the fatal strike. Marin stared at the man she was exactly 90 minutes away from marrying. She finally saw him not as a devoted partner, but as a hollow corporate suit, terrified of bad press. She realized in that crushing, silent moment that he cared infinitely more about managing his public image than he cared about her breaking heart. Marin did not cry or throw a tantrum. She reached up, slowly unpinned the intricate heavy veil from her hair, and let the expensive white silk fall to the wooden floor. In a voice completely stripped of its usual performative sweetness, she looked directly at the venue manager and told him to cancel the event. The lavish million-dollar wedding was over before a single guest even took their assigned seat. True to my terms, my father did not hide from the fallout. As the chaotic reality set in and the vendors began furiously packing up their expensive equipment, Wade walked out into the grand lobby where our closest relatives were mingling in confusion before the toxic rumors could even begin to take shape. He stood before them and delivered the unvarnished truth. He confessed to his brothers and sisters that I had not walked away in a fit of jealousy. He admitted that I had been deliberately pushed out and that his family had committed an unjustifiable betrayal against me. He burned his own pristine reputation to the ground to clear my name. The seasons shifted, and the dense smoke of that afternoon eventually settled. Harbor Street Holdings was fully restored, the fraudulent encumbrance completely erased from the municipal records without triggering a public indictment. My parents were forced to drastically restructure their entire financial lives to cover the devastating cancellation fees. They sold their sprawling suburban home, liquidated their unnecessary assets, and moved into a much smaller, quieter space. More importantly, they finally began the agonizing, incredibly slow process of learning how to apologize to me without attaching a defensive justification to the end of their sentences. Marin packed her bags, left Charleston entirely and permanently severed all contact with Preston and his toxic family. For the first time in her adult life, she was forced to secure a regular job and pay her own rent. Instead of floating comfortably within a manufactured orbit created by someone else, the relationship between the two of us is nowhere near warm. There are no long late-night phone calls or casual sisterly brunches. But for the very first time, the space between us is built on absolute reality rather than a fragile, exhausting performance. Back in Charlotte, the massive supply chain restructuring deal I had closed resulted in my formal promotion to senior director at Beacon Ridge Logistics. But the most profound change was entirely internal. I permanently retired from my lifelong role as the daughter who could survive any level of neglect. Jude and I spent our weekends walking through new neighborhoods, drawing up architectural plans for a custom house built strictly for us. We were designing a life where I never again had to ask for permission to take up space. They erased my name from the wedding as easily as removing an extra chair. But when the dust finally settled, I was the only one left standing, while everyone who ever treated me as a backup plan was exposed as the true stranger. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. Thanks.